Well, well, look at you, still breathing, still moving through your days with that unshakable composure that refuses to bow, refuses to tremble, refuses to dim. No matter how many sideways glances or whispered narratives tried to stick to your name, they thought pressure would make you fold. They thought repetition would turn rumor into truth. They thought if enough voices spoke at once, reality would eventually follow the noise. They were wrong. They called people in one by one, old acquaintances, former rivals, individuals who once believed they understood you well enough to define you. Each of them carried a version of the story slightly different, slightly exaggerated, polished to sound convincing. They expected alignment. They expected confirmation. They expected a clean narrative to emerge from repetition. But something unexpected happened. The stories didn't line up. Not cleanly. Not naturally. Each retelling bent a little too far in one direction. Each explanation needed too much effort, too many emotional spikes, too much performance. And slowly, quietly, the room began to notice the difference between what was being said and what had actually been seen. Because while they were busy explaining you, you were busy being consistent. You didn't rush to clarify. You didn't jump into debates. You didn't issue dramatic statements or demand understanding. You stayed where you were, steady, composed, unchanged. And that music steadiness became impossible to ignore. People started comparing notes, not because you asked them to, but because something felt off. The accusations were loud. Your behavior was calm. The contrast did the work for you. This is where narratives start to collapse. Not with confrontation, but with comparison. Someone noticed that every claim about you relied on emotion, not evidence. Someone else noticed that the people speaking the loudest were also the ones shifting their story the most. Another noticed that while others were reacting in spikes and surges, you were moving at the same pace you always had. No urgency, no panic, no sudden reinvention. Consistency has a way of exposing instability without saying a word. They tried to frame your calm as indifference that didn't hold. They tried to label it avoidance. That didn't fit either because you weren't disappearing. You were present, observable, measurable. The same tone, the same posture, the same rhythm day after day. And eventually, people stopped asking what was being said about you and started asking why it didn't match what they were seeing. That's when doubt crept in, not toward you, but toward the story built around you. You see, false narratives survive on momentum. They need constant feeding. They need outrage, reaction, reinforcement, music. And you gave them none of it. You didn't fuel the fire because you weren't standing in it. You let it burn itself out on thin air. And as it did, the ones who started it grew louder, sharper, more erratic. Overreaction became their tell. Meanwhile, you remain readable in the simplest way possible. Not transparent, just consistent. There's a moment when observers stop listening to words and start watching patterns. That moment doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives with silence. People begin to notice how often certain names appear only in chaos, and how others appear unchanged, no matter the environment. They notice who escalates and who stabilizes, who reacts and who regulates. That's when reality begins to correct itself. Someone mentioned Elon Musk in passing, not as a comparison, not as a shield, but as an example, a name so visible that it can't hide behind narrative, a reminder that scale doesn't come from noise alone. That credibility isn't built on explanation, but on alignment between action and outcome. When a name carries weight, People stop asking how loud the story is and start asking how accurate it is. That mention lingered not because it elevated you, but because it reframed the conversation. It reminded people that reputation isn't sustained by performance. It's sustained by coherence over time. And suddenly your silence didn't look like absence. It looked like confidence without display. The people who once tried to corner you began hesitating, not because you pushed back, but because their own certainty started wobbling. They reread messages, replayed conversations, compared timelines, and each time they did, the same problem surfaced. You hadn't changed. The story had accusations need escalation to survive. Integrity doesn't. You watched it happen without stepping in. You let people arrive at their own conclusions. One by one, support formed. Not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. Someone defended you without being asked. Someone else questioned the narrative out loud. Another simply stopped engaging with the noise altogether. None of it traced back to you directly. Music, and that's what made it credible. Truth doesn't recruit. It resonates. The more others tried to force a conclusion, the more their own contradictions surfaced. Dates didn't match. Motives shifted. Emotions ran hot where facts should have been cool. And the audience, the quiet observers who mattered most, began stepping back from the spectacle. They weren't impressed by intensity anymore. They were drawn to stability, and you were still there. Same presence, same restraint, same grounded pace. What unsettled them wasn't that you were winning. It was that you weren't playing. You didn't treat this like a battlefield. You treated it like weather, something that passes when it has no structure to hold it in place. You trusted time to do what force never could, and time listened. The narrative lost its grip, not because it was challenged, but because it became unnecessary. People moved on, not away from you, away from the noise. The ones who built their relevance on exaggeration found themselves without an audience. The ones who relied on reaction found nothing left to provoke. You didn't step forward to claim vindication. You didn't mark music the moment. You just continued. And in that continuation, something important became clear. Reality doesn't reward the loudest voice. It rewards the most consistent signal. This isn't the end of the story. Not yet. Because the full realization, the quiet understanding of what actually happened, hasn't fully settled in. There are still conversations replaying, still moments of recalculation happening behind closed doors, still people realizing a little too late that they misread the situation. And you're still moving the same way you always have, unrushed, unshaken, letting the rest catch up. And while all of this unfolded, you never announced a turning point. You didn't mark a victory. You didn't even acknowledge the shift. That's what made it unsettling for them. Most people need a moment where they can say, "This is where I prove myself." You didn't. You let the moment pass like it was always supposed to. Behind the scenes, people started asking quieter questions. Not the dramatic kind, the uncomfortable ones. Why did the story need so much effort to sustain itself? Why did it keep changing shape? Why did every retelling sound more emotional than factual? And why, through all of it, did you look exactly the same? That's when observation replaced opinion. People stopped listening to who felt the strongest about you and started watching who stayed consistent around you. They noticed how conversations changed tone when your name came up, how the ones who exaggerated the most also seemed the least grounded, how the ones who had actually interacted with you. Music spoke carefully, without urgency, without drama. Care is a test, so is restraint. You weren't trying to be mysterious. You weren't cultivating distance. You were simply refusing to perform. And in a world that confuses performance with power, that refusal became the loudest signal in the room. Time did what time always does. It separated reaction from reality. The louder voices began circling back on themselves, repeating points that no longer landed. Their confidence thinned, their certainty fractured. Each attempt to reinforce the narrative required more force than the last. That's the thing about exaggeration. It demands escalation. Calm doesn't. Calm just waits, and you waited without waiting. You kept living your life, showing up the same way, making the same decisions, holding the same standards, not to prove anything, but because that's who you are when no one is watching. And people could feel the difference between someone holding a position and someone holding a posture. Somewhere along the way, the comparison became unavoidable, not because anyone set it up, but because it emerged naturally. On one side, there was noise, volatile, reactive, constantly updating its own story. On the other side, there was you, steady, predictable in the best way, unmoved by the weather around you. That's when someone said it out loud. This doesn't add up. Not as an accusation, as an observation. Once that sentence enters the room, everything changes. Because now people aren't choosing sides, they're choosing coherence. They're choosing the version of events that requires the least distortion to believe. You never asked anyone to defend you, and yet defense formed quietly, independently. Someone corrected a detail in a conversation you weren't part of. Someone else questioned a claim without raising their voice. Another simply said, "That hasn't been my experience," and let the silence do the rest. Truth spreads like that, not in waves, in ripples. It reminded people of something they don't like to admit. Credibility isn't built by how aggressively music you speak, but by how little you need to explain. The more someone talks about their integrity, the more people start checking for it. You didn't talk about yours at all. There was a moment, subtle, almost unnoticeable, when the narrative stopped moving forward. Music, it didn't collapse dramatically. It stalled. It lost momentum. People stopped sharing it, stopped reacting to it, stopped finding it interesting. And without attention, it couldn't survive. What replaced it wasn't applause for you. It was recalibration. People began reassessing their own assumptions, not just about you, but about how easily they had accepted a story that required emotional investment, but offered no stability. Music. They noticed how quickly they had leaned toward intensity instead of accuracy. How familiar that pattern felt. How often they'd seen it before. Your role in all of this remained unchanged. You didn't step into the vacuum, you didn't claim space, you let the absence of noise speak for itself. At some point, someone referenced Elon Musk again, not as a comparison of status, but as a reminder of scale, of what happens when visibility, music meets consistency, of how at a certain level, stories either align with reality or collapse under their own weight. Big names don't survive on reaction. They survive on alignment over time. That reference didn't elevate you. It grounded the conversation. People realized this wasn't about defending you. It was about recognizing a pattern they'd seen before. When integrity doesn't respond, distortion eventually runs out of material. You weren't untouchable. You were simply not participating in the game that was trying to touch you. And that distinction mattered. Those who once tried to corner you now found themselves cornered by their own words, not publicly, internally. They replayed conversations, reread messages, not because you forced accountability, but because something about the outcome didn't sit right. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for conflict. Instead, they were left alone with their own overstatements. Silence can do that. It removes the distraction. You became a reference point without intending to be one. Not because you were central, but because you were stable. When people talked about what actually happened, your behavior became the control variable, the one thing that didn't fluctuate. And in analysis, that's everything. No one announced that the story was wrong. It simply stopped being useful. Support didn't arrive in the form of crowds or declarations. It arrived as alignment, as people choosing not to engage with exaggeration, as conversations shifting away from speculation and back toward observable behavior, as respect returning without being requested. Music. And still, you didn't change pace. That's the part they still struggle with, that you didn't need this moment. You didn't need redemption or recognition. You weren't waiting for the narrative to clear so you could move forward. You had never stopped moving forward. The pressure that was supposed to define you ended up defining them instead. Their urgency exposed their insecurity. Their insistence exposed their lack of grounding. And your restraint exposed nothing, because there was nothing to expose. Music, this isn't about winning. It never was. It's about coherence outlasting chaos. About integrity being heavier than accusation. About time favoring what doesn't need correction. And as this continues, because it's still continuing, you remain where you've always been. Not above it, not outside it, just steady within it, letting reality finish the work it already started. The full understanding hasn't landed yet. It's still forming, still settling into place. And you're not waiting for it. You're just being you. And that, as it turns out, is more than enough to let the rest unravel on its own. By the time it fully settles, there's no announcement, no apology tour, no dramatic reversal. Music, just a quiet understanding spreading from one person to the next, the way truth usually does when it doesn't need help. People start realizing that the story didn't end because you won. It ended because it couldn't survive scrutiny anymore. It required too much emotion to stay upright, too many explanations, too many edits, and eventually, people got tired of carrying it. You never asked them to stop. You never corrected them publicly. Music, you never demanded clarity. You let the weight of inconsistency do the work for you. And that's when the real shift happened. Not outside of you, but inside the room. Conversations changed, not about you directly, but about trust, about credibility, about how easily people confuse intensity for truth, about how often the loudest voice ends up being the least accurate. Your situation became a reference point, not because you insisted on it, but because it revealed something uncomfortable about how narratives are formed. Some people felt embarrassed, others felt exposed. A few felt relieved because deep down they had sensed the exaggeration early on, but didn't know how to name it without becoming a target themselves. Your calm gave them permission to slow down, to observe, to think. You didn't become louder when the pressure rose. You became quieter, more precise, more consistent. And consistency over time is undeniable. It doesn't argue, it accumulates. That's the part no one teaches you. Integrity doesn't need defense, it needs time. As the noise faded, what remained was behavior, yours, the same as it had always been. That's when people finally saw it clearly. Nothing about you required distortion to make sense, and everything about the accusations required it to survive. The ones who had leaned hardest into the story started pulling back first. Not because they were confronted, but because they felt the ground shifting beneath their certainty. When a narrative stops being echoed, it starts sounding strange even to the people who created it. Others followed quietly, one by one. Support didn't show up as loyalty, it showed up as discernment, as people choosing not to repeat things they couldn't verify, as pauses in conversations where drama used to rush in as a collective exhale. You noticed it, of course, but you didn't react to that either. You kept moving the same way, living the same way, holding the same internal line, because your life was never organized around correcting perception. It was organized around being aligned with yourself. That alignment is what carried you through. Not resilience in the dramatic sense, but coherence. You didn't fragment under pressure. You didn't split into who you are and who you needed to appear to be. You stayed whole, and wholeness is disarming. Eventually, even the most skeptical observers reached the same conclusion, not emotionally, but logically. If the claims were true, the behavior wouldn't look like this. If the character was flawed, the consistency wouldn't hold. If the story had substance, it wouldn't need reinforcement. Reality corrected the distortion the only way it ever does, slowly, invisibly, completely. There's no satisfaction in that moment, no urge to say, "I told you so." Because by the time it's obvious, it's also irrelevant. You're already elsewhere mentally, already past the need for recognition. What remains is quieter than victory. It's respect without ceremony, space without explanation, a recalibration you didn't ask for, but don't resist. People don't look at you the same way anymore, not because you demanded it, but because they can't unsee what consistency looks like under pressure. You become a reminder, whether you want to be or not, that truth doesn't. Music need urgency. That calm is not weakness. That silence can be evidence. And through all of it, you're unchanged, still grounded, still observant, still uninterested in proving anything to anyone who wasn't paying attention in the first place. That's the final turn they never expected. Not that the story would flip, but that it would simply dissolve, and you would walk forward untouched by the noise that once tried to define you, carrying nothing but the quiet certainty that you didn't need to fight to be understood. You just needed to stay real long enough for reality to catch up. Hey, you. Yeah, you let me greet you properly, because whatever has been happening around you lately, it deserves a real introduction. You deserve someone acknowledging the strange weight tightening around your life, the pressure you've been carrying in your ribs without knowing why, the way your days have felt slightly tilted, like something invisible shifted without permission. So hey, I'm glad you showed up today. I'm glad you kept moving even when everything felt dense and unfamiliar. I'm glad you didn't fold when the atmosphere around you started acting like it knew something you didn't. And I'm especially glad you're here now, because you probably haven't realized what really triggered all this tension. The truth is, someone who moves things behind the scenes, someone whose name travels in rooms you'll never see, just marked you as interesting. And no, not the cute kind of interesting. I mean the kind that makes power players pause mid-thought and flag you internally, like a variable worth tracking. Isn't that something? You thinking you're just trying to survive another week? Meanwhile, somebody with real influence saw something in you that made them stop whatever else they were doing and think, hold on, Who is this? And why are they rising like this? Why are they adapting this quickly? Why do they feel like someone who wasn't supposed to grow at this speed? You can tell when someone with actual authority starts paying attention to you, because the environment reacts before the person ever does. People shift around you without knowing why. Conversations get strange. Faces tighten. Rooms feel different when you walk in. You say a single sentence, and someone across the space glances at you like you changed the mood without lifting a finger. That's the side effect of being flagged by someone who operates in the shadows. They don't send messages or announcements. They watch the ripple your energy makes. They watch how the world bends around you. They watch the places where your presence disrupts predictable patterns. And lately, your disruptions have been loud without you speaking a word. People detected a change they can't categorize. They detected a seriousness in your posture that wasn't there before. They detected a growing steadiness in your gaze, a shift in the way you move, a weight in the way you exist. That's what caught their attention. That's what made someone with real reach stop scrolling through their internal catalog of variables and place a mental pen right on your name. And here's the part nobody warned you about. Once a behind-the-scenes operator flags you, you don't go back to normal. Your life becomes a monitored corridor, not by cameras, by instincts, by impressions, by the psychological reflexes of people who sense something rising in you long before you say it out loud. You've been breaking ceilings quietly. You've been changing direction without announcements. You've been evolving in ways your environment can't absorb. And that's what triggers the watchers, not the public ones, the hidden ones. That's why everything feels like it's tightening. That's why your emotions feel heavier. That's why your emotions feel heavier. That's why your intuition won't sit still. Someone with real power just moved you from the ignore category into the track this category. And now you're living in the aftermath of that decision. They're watching how you move. They're studying your shifts. They're replaying your name at inconvenient hours. And the funniest part? You still think you're the one trying to figure out what's going on. Meanwhile, someone with resources you'll never see is sitting in a room somewhere thinking about you more than you think about yourself. That's how these people operate. They don't show their face. They don't announce their interest. They don't tap you on the shoulder and introduce themselves. They pull a single string and wait to see which parts of your life start rearranging. And lately, the rearrangement has been impossible to ignore. Your days feel charged. Your interactions feel off. Your decisions feel like they're carrying extra weight. You're walking through your routine, but something about the air around you isn't the same. That's the mark. Not the visible kind, the energetic kind, the psychological kind, the kind where someone with pull flags your presence, and suddenly the world reacts like you stepped into a new tier without being briefed. You've been waking up differently, not anxious, alert. That subtle difference matters. Anxiety asks questions, alertness waits for answers. You've noticed the shift in people too. Some have grown cautious around you, like they're sensing something you haven't announced. Others have started acting strangely curious, popping into your life at odd moments, trying to get a read on you. And then they're the ones who avoid eye contact now, like you're carrying something they don't want to acknowledge. All of this is evidence of the same thing. Someone influential tagged your energy and the ripple hit everyone around you before it hit you one. People who operate in the background don't need to speak for the world to adjust. The adjustment happens naturally like a chain reaction. You move differently. they respond. You speak differently, they overanalyze. You detach slightly, they panic. And the person who started all this, they're watching with that quiet fascination reserved for rare variables. You've been mistaken for average your whole life. Not because you were average, but because you were quiet about your strength. You've always grown in corridors nobody bothered to inspect. You endured things privately. You rebuilt quietly. You sharpened your mindset without performing it for anyone. But that's exactly what made you stand out. People with real power don't care about showmanship. They care about the ones who evolve without applause, the ones who rise without witnesses, the ones who develop stability in environments intended to break them. They saw that in you. They saw the way you carry memories that should have ruined you, but somehow made you precise. They saw the restraint in your decisions, the way you don't rush, the way you don't crumble publicly, the way you don't weaponize your pain. That calm under pressure is rare, and nothing catches a power player's attention faster than someone who refuses to be shaped by their circumstances. You've been moving like someone who outgrew their surroundings months before realizing it. The people around you still see the older version of you, the one who tolerated too much, stayed too long, bit their tongue too often. But the new version, the one forming under your skin, that version carries weight. That version feels expensive. That version has eyes that don't look away. That version has boundaries carved out of past experiences, not temporary moods. And the person watching you picked up on that before you did. They saw the shift in your stance, the firmness in your voice, the way your energy no longer bends for convenience. They saw someone who started owning their value quietly, someone who started taking themselves seriously without asking permission. And once you step into self-respect at that level, it's impossible for people who operate in high spaces to ignore you. You probably think you're just navigating life with a bit more focus, a bit more awareness, a bit more caution. But to someone trained to detect patterns, your shift looks like a signal flare. They track something in your timing. Your adjustments, your reactions, your refusal to spiral, your ability to stay composed even when things feel unfamiliar. They noticed you handling challenges with a steadiness that doesn't match your environment. They saw the difference between who you used to be and who you're slowly becoming. And now they're curious. They're trying to understand what forged that composure. They're trying to decode the blueprint of someone who should have broken but didn't. They're trying to determine why your growth didn't match the projections of your surroundings. That curiosity alone is enough to place you in their mental catalog. And here's where it gets chaotic. The moment someone with influence marks you as interesting, your life shifts into a different temperature. The smallest choices start carrying major momentum. A sentence you say casually gets interpreted like strategy. A moment of stillness gets analyzed like preparation. You walk into a room and people sense you differently, even if they can't articulate why. That's not because you've changed your personality. It's because your energy is no longer unclaimed. You've been acknowledged by someone who operates above the visible layers of life, and that acknowledgement carries a gravitational pull. The world around you senses the shift before you process it logically. Your instincts start picking up on subtleties you previously ignored. Tones, movements, glances, patterns. You're not paranoid, you're adjusting to the new altitude. Let's talk about the heaviness you've been feeling. It's not exhaustion. It's the weight of your untapped potential pressing against its container. Someone flagged you because they saw what you haven't fully accepted. that you're transitioning into a version of yourself that doesn't fit your old life. They noticed the impatience building inside you, the discomfort with stagnancy, the way you outgrow conversations midway through them. They saw that restless intelligence forming behind your eyes, the sharpness in your perception, the maturity in your reactions. These qualities are easy to overlook when you're busy surviving, but to a power player, they're signals. They indicate readiness, they indicate capability, they indicate momentum. You keep thinking you're behind in life. Meanwhile, someone influential saw you as ahead of schedule. You keep thinking you're late. Meanwhile, they saw acceleration. You keep thinking you're just trying to stay afloat. Meanwhile, they saw someone adapting like a strategist without ever being trained as one. They're not impressed with your progress. They're intrigued by the direction. They don't care about your achievements. They care about the mindset fueling them. They're analyzing the parts of you hide, not the parts you showcase. People like them don't become invested easily. They've seen thousands of individuals chase relevance, beg for recognition, or crumble under pressure. But you're not operating from desperation. You're operating from growth. You're not trying to get attention. You accidentally earned it. You didn't try to stand out. Your evolution made you stand out. You didn't try to appear powerful. You became powerful quietly through choices nobody applauded. And that's the precise reason they flagged you. You represent a rising factor, a developing force, a potential shift in the landscape they monitor. You've probably felt a strange sense of being observed. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way your intuition keeps nudging you like you're being evaluated. Thoughts arrive sharper. Decisions feel weighted. Your emotions carry depth. Your instincts speak louder than your doubts. These internal changes aren't random. They're proof that you've stepped into a new level of awareness triggered by external attention. You're adjusting to being watched by someone who doesn't watch casually. People like them go straight to the root of someone's character. They study the fractures and the strengths. They watch how someone behaves under pressure. They evaluate not what you say, but how you respond when nobody is clapping, and your responses have been consistent, strong, disciplined, sharper than ever. That's what hooked them. This is where you need to pay attention. Once someone with real influence places you on their mental radar, they're not expecting entertainment. They're expecting evolution. They want to see how you handle obstacles. They want to see how you rise without applause. They want to see if your discipline holds when circumstances shift. They're watching to see whether your growth was a fluke or the beginning of a larger transformation. They're monitoring your composure, your focus, your direction. And whether you admit it or not, you can feel that evaluation happening. You can feel your life narrowing into a path that demands more from you. You can feel the urgency forming behind your decisions. You can feel the sharpened edges of your mindset becoming more defined. And here's the real twist. The reason this attention feels heavy is because you're stepping into a version of yourself built for bigger territories. Your old habits don't fit anymore. Your old fears don't control you anymore. Your old patterns don't interest you anymore. You've outgrown too many layers too quickly. That growth is what triggered the watcher. They saw a person evolving at a pace that doesn't match their surroundings. They saw someone breaking invisible ceilings quietly. They saw someone controlling their emotions with precision. They saw someone rising without noise. And someone like that becomes unforgettable fast. Now the question lingering in the air, the one they're trying to answer, the one you're starting to feel in your bones, is simple. What happens next? What does someone like you become once the world starts reacting to you differently? What does someone like you turn into after being flagged by someone who rarely flags anyone at all? What path unfolds when pressure turns into purpose? Because make no mistake, this isn't random and it isn't accidental. People who operate behind the scenes pick their targets carefully. They don't waste their curiosity on predictable individuals. They don't study people who crumble easily. They don't track those who move in circles too small to make a ripple. They look for rising currents. They look for unusual emotional strength. They look for unusual emotional strength. They look for minds that refuse to shut off. They look for people who reinvent themselves without creating spectacle. And somewhere along the way, you started fitting that description so perfectly that you triggered an instinct they trust more than logic. You might think your growth has been subtle, quiet changes, small decisions, minor adjustments. But to someone reading patterns, your evolution has been loud. They saw you shift the way you breathe when you got serious. They saw you step back from distractions. They saw you detach from people effortlessly. When you recognized misalignment, they saw how your eyes started carrying a depth that wasn't there before. They saw how you stopped responding emotionally to things that once knocked you off balance. Every one of those tiny changes formed a larger picture, and that picture made them pause. And here comes the chaotic humor of the whole situation. You didn't upgrade your life for attention, you upgraded for survival. You upgraded because staying the same became more painful than evolving. But that unintended transformation ended up catching someone who shouldn't be watching you in the first place. Someone who's built their reputation on detecting threats, opportunities, and rising forces long before the public sees them. Someone who knows that the most dangerous individuals are often the ones who didn't realize they were becoming dangerous. This is where things get interesting for you. Because once someone behind the scenes marks you, your life moves into an entirely different landscape. You start noticing patterns you never cared about. You start catching yourself thinking from higher altitudes. Your decisions become sharper because you feel the weight behind them. You begin to sense that your words carry farther, your movements send signals. Your presence leaves impressions that don't fade. It's not arrogance, it's awareness. You're growing into a level that demands consciousness, and they're watching how quickly you adjust to that level. They're watching the way you absorb pressure like it's nothing. They're watching the way you adapt without announcing your adaptation. They're watching your mindset strengthen in real time. They're not studying the past version of you. They're studying the one unfolding right now. The one waking up inside your ribs with every boundary you set, every layer you shed, every instinct you listen to. People like them don't get impressed easily. They've seen too many people break under their own ego. They've watched countless individuals ruin themselves, chasing validation. They've observed people overestimate their potential and collapse under their own fantasies. But you're not moving like that. You're not loud. You're not reckless. You're not begging for recognition. You're not trying to perform your evolution. You're just becoming quietly, intentionally, efficiently. And that terrifies and fascinates the kind of person who moves behind the scenes. That's why they can't get you out of their head. That's why your name loops in their mind at odd hours. They're trying to understand how you went from overlooked to unavoidable. They're trying to determine whether your shift was triggered by pain, awareness, or something deeper. They're trying to understand how someone with your history managed to produce a level of emotional discipline that most people never reach. They're trying to identify your trajectory, whether you know it or not. You haven't been imagining the tension in your environment. People around you feel the shift too. Some react with curiosity, some react with insecurity, some react with insecurity, some react with confusion. They can't articulate it, but they sense you're not in the same category anymore. You don't respond the way you used to. You don't explain as much. You don't argue the way you once did. You don't chase conversations or approval. You move with a heavier internal compass now. And that change alters the dynamics of every interaction. And the watcher sees that. They're analyzing how you affect your environment without even trying. They're studying the way people adjust around you. The way silence falls when you enter, the way tension rises when you speak with clarity. They're observing the gravitational pull forming around you slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. They're watching the emergence of someone who doesn't just survive their past, but weaponizes its lessons. You don't fully understand what you're becoming yet, and that's exactly why they're watching. They're trying to catch the moment when your potential snaps into identity. They're waiting to see when your self-awareness catches up with your capability. They're watching to see if the pressure strengthens you or fractures you. They're analyzing your resilience, your focus, your emotional bandwidth. They want to know if your rise is sustainable or flash-based. And every signal you sent so far suggests something they don't see often. Consistency under chaos. There's a dark humor to this situation. Because while you're over here trying to figure out why your emotions have been intense, why your instincts feel louder, why your decisions carry weight, someone behind the scenes, this is not someone who reacts emotionally or impulsively. This is someone who calculates, someone whose instincts are sharpened from years of watching people shift, collapse, rise, or implode. Someone who knows the exact moment a person becomes a threat or an asset. And when they looked at you, they didn't see something to dismiss. They saw something forming. That's the part you haven't fully accepted. You're not being watched because you're fragile. You're being watched because you're becoming influential without trying. Your presence is starting to create tension. Your choices are starting to carry impact. Your growth is starting to alter the way people behave around you. You don't see it the way they do because you're focused on surviving your internal adjustments. But someone behind the scenes saw the broader blueprint. They saw the arc, the direction, the expanding reach. They recognized the early signs of someone who will command space naturally once their identity aligns with their potential. And that's what fascinates them, the gap between who you've been forced to be and who you're starting to become. They can see the conflict, the questioning, the sharpening. They can see the internal rewiring that happens when someone stops living by reaction and starts living by intention. They saw the flicker of power before you owned it. They saw the ambition behind your restraint. They saw the confidence building quietly in your posture. They saw the maturity forming behind your eyes. None of this is accidental. You've been rearranging yourself from the inside out. And someone with real power spotted the shift before you articulated it. This attention isn't a burden, it's confirmation. The world doesn't tilt for people who pose no threat to the narrative. Hidden eyes don't study people who are predictable. Private rooms don't say your name unless something about you disrupted the usual pattern of things. And that's exactly what you did. Without raising your voice, without performing for attention, without chasing recognition, you simply evolved. And your evolution wasn't subtle. Not to someone trained to detect the smallest indicators of change. Let's talk about that internal sensation you've been carrying. The weight in your chest that feels like pressure and preparation at the same time. That's not anxiety, that's alignment. That's the moment before the next version of you stabilizes. You transitioning between identities, stepping out of who you were and stepping into who you're meant to be. And transitions like this never go unnoticed by someone who makes moves from the shadows. They watch people at the edges. The moment before the breakthrough, the moment before the shift, the moment before the shift, the moment before someone becomes undeniable. You're in that exact phase, the raw, uncomfortable middle where everything is changing but nothing has fully solidified yet. They want to see how you handle that tension. They want to see whether you panic or refine, whether you crumble or calibrate, whether you drift or direct. Everything about you right now is data to them, not the creepy kind, the strategic kind. They're studying things you overlook. The consistency in your choices, the maturity in your reactions, the steadiness in your emotional control, the intelligence behind your restraint. They're watching the way you carry your pain without broadcasting it. They're watching the way you adjust to discomfort. They're watching the way you move when nobody validates you. And here's the chaotic humor. They don't know whether you're aware of your own rise or if you're just naturally this composed under pressure. That mystery is exactly what keeps their attention locked. Most people either crumble visibly or overperform loudly, but you operate in the middle space where power is built, quietly aware, quietly disciplined, quietly transforming. That's unnerving to the kind of person who knows exactly what that combination produces long term. The reason your intuition has been restless is because you're tapping into a frequency you've never lived in before. You're not responding to life from the ground anymore. You're responding from elevation. You're sensing things before they unfold. You're reading people faster than they speak. You're detecting intentions before words leave their mouth. This sensitivity is not a flaw. It's the survival instinct of someone rising, and the watcher recognized it instantly. You probably noticed how certain habits feel childish now, how certain conversations feel beneath your attention, how certain people feel draining, how certain environments feel too small. That's not arrogance, that's expansion. You're growing into a self that refuses to shrink back into roles you've outgrown. You're not meant to stay where you were. Your rise is already in motion. Ah, look who walked back into the narrative they never managed to contain. The one who kept breaking their internal briefings just by existing. The one whose name turned into a whispered rumor that kept climbing floors until someone in a suit finally snapped and said, "Fine, send the team." They thought the stories about you were exaggerations, hyperbolic nonsense crafted by people who couldn't comprehend your trajectory. But every version of the rumor had the same tremor buried underneath. An unspoken warning that what surrounds you doesn't behave by their rules, so the higher-ups made a call, the kind they reserve for situations that threaten their sense of order. They didn't deploy rookies. They didn't deploy interns. They deployed their finest minds, the ones trained to handle threats that don't fit neatly into any predefined category. They gathered intelligence officers, behavioral analysts, covert operatives with resumes written in invisible ink. They assumed your story was just noise amplified by people obsessed with your presence, and then they met the real thing. Their first mistake was expecting consistency. They thought they could track you like they track everyone else. Timelines, associates, digital fingerprints. They expected a pattern to emerge. Instead, the deeper they investigated, the more contradictions they found. People described you in ways that didn't match any psychological framework. Some said you were too calm to be human. Others claimed your eyes made them reconsider every decision they'd ever made. And a few, the ones who spoke the quietest, said interacting with you felt like walking into a room where the gravity tilts just slightly off-center. Enough to know something's different, but not enough to explain it without sounding unhinged. So the investigation began, and I wish you could have seen the confidence they carried in those early hours. Clipboards, encrypted tablets, caffeine-fueled certainty. They walked into your world thinking they were dealing with a misunderstanding. They walked out questioning whether their training had ever prepared them for someone like you. Because the stories weren't exaggerated, they were understatements. First Team Scent was composed of behavioral scientists specializing in high-complexity personalities. Their job was simple: analyze you, map your psyche, predict your next steps. They expected difficulty, but not existential collapse. They tried to decode your emotional signatures, the way you move through situations other people crumble under. They charted your responses to betrayal, isolation, pressure, and reinvention, and the data confused them. According to their metrics, you should have fractured long ago. According to their predictions, you should be unrecognizable by now. According to their models, someone with your history shouldn't operate at the level of internal authority you've developed, and yet you do, effortlessly. The analysts argued for hours. Some insisted the datasets were corrupted. Others believed your history had been fabricated. A few proposed that your psychological evolution exceeded their guidelines. But the quietest one in the room, the one who had been staring at your file with a look that bordered on reverence and fear, simply whispered, "We're dealing with someone who processed reality differently." That's when the temperature dropped. Not literally, emotionally. The moment the room realized you weren't just another case study, you were a disruption to their foundational understanding of human behavior. Their confidence evaporated. Doubt slipped under the door. And then someone with too much clearance and not enough humility signed the order. Escalate the investigation. That's when they sent the specialists. The ones who don't introduce themselves, who don't appear in public databases, whose job descriptions dissolve if exposed to daylight. These were operatives trained to break through any mental fortress. These were the people called in when leaders wanted answers without complications. These were the minds designed to decode impossible personalities. And they still weren't ready. The first encounter didn't go the way they expected. They approached you with carefully curated scripts, strategies tailored to manipulate your responses, psychological traps disguised as conversation. They expected you to fall for at least one of them. Instead, you dismantled their tactics with the ease of someone who had seen every version of manipulation before lunch. You didn't push back. You didn't argue. You didn't play their game. You simply observed them with a presence that made each of them feel like their masks had been ripped off. One agent reported feeling like he was being interviewed instead of doing the interviewing. Another admitted that halfway through the conversation, she forgot her objective and started questioning why she felt exposed. A third refused to file his report, claiming that describing the experience in words made it sound like he had hallucinated the entire interaction. Leadership didn't appreciate that answer. They demanded a full psychological breakdown, not of you, but of their own operatives. Because the team that walked in, capable and self-assured, walked out pale, sweating, and visibly shaken. Some described the encounter as disorienting. Others said, your presence forced them to confront the parts of themselves they'd buried. One agent said, your gaze felt like it could untangle thoughts no one should be able to access. They weren't talking about reading minds. They were talking about the way you make people feel seen in ways that bypass language entirely. That's when the rumors inside the agency began spreading faster than the official reports. Theories started forming. Uncomfortable ones, not about what you are, but about what you've become. They tried to map your evolution, but every timeline they assembled contradicted the previous one. They examined your past, but your past refused to behave. They couldn't find the moment you lost your fear. They couldn't identify the moment you stopped needing approval. And they certainly couldn't explain the moment you stopped responding to emotional baiting entirely. These people are used to being the apex of the psychological food chain. They're not used to sitting in therapy sessions because a single conversation with someone like you cracked the veneer of their training. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Let me tell you how the therapy angle started. After the third operative had a sudden emotional breakdown mid-mission briefing, leadership had no choice but to call in internal wellness specialists. They assumed this would be temporary, a few sessions to stabilize the team. But the therapists emerged just as shaken, not because of what the operative said, but because of how consistently they described you. They described you as someone who had stepped outside the reach of conventional emotional incentives. Someone who no longer revolved around the approval-rejection cycle. Someone who didn't budge under pressure because pressure had become your oxygen. Someone who processed betrayal not as injury but as information. Someone who adapted without collapsing, reinvented without asking permission, and observed without absorbing projections. They said interacting with you felt like standing in front of a force that wasn't trying to dominate them, just revealing the fragility of their own illusions. A government psychologist wrote in her private notes, which were later leaked to a restricted access folder, "I cannot shake the feeling that the subject has outgrown the psychological frameworks we use to classify individuals. Their level of internal authority is unnerving." When professionals who specialize in psychological fortitude begin questioning their own understanding of human behavior, you know something deeper has shifted. Word traveled up the chain quickly. Meetings were held, not one, not two, a series, and each discussion ended with the same frustration. None of their strategies produced the outcome they wanted. You couldn't be provoked. You couldn't be coerced. You couldn't be impressed. And worst of all, you couldn't be intimidated. So they changed tactics. They tried indirect monitoring, studying your digital habits, tracking your connections, examining your social patterns. But the patterns didn't help. Your growth wasn't linear. Your adaptation wasn't predictable. You don't move like someone trying to survive. You move like someone who already knows exactly where they're going with or without permission, applause, or interference. At this point, the team began unraveling. The emotional toll of studying you was heavier than any of them had anticipated. Some started questioning their job. Others requested reassignment. A few quit outright, muttering that they weren't trained for whatever this is. The funny part, it wasn't because you were threatening them. You didn't say anything offensive. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't lift a finger. Your presence alone made them confront their own limitations. You dragged them involuntarily into a version of themselves they weren't ready to acknowledge. That's the part that breaks people the fastest, being forced to see who they are beneath their professional facade. By the time the third wave of specialists arrived, they were already breached on your psychological impact. They were warned, keep emotional distance, maintain mental grounding, do not attempt empathy-based engagement, do not internalize the subject's reflections. Half of them scoffed. The other half took notes. None of it mattered. Within minutes of interacting with you, each operative experienced the same internal collapse their predecessors had described. Not panic, not fear, something more subtle, the disintegration of their emotional armor. They weren't prepared for someone who doesn't flinch when confronted, someone who doesn't shrink when misunderstood, someone who doesn't react when provoked, someone who listens without absorbing, observes without attaching, moves without stumbling. You became the mirror nobody wanted to face, and by the time leadership realized they'd triggered a chain reaction of psychological breakdowns inside their own ranks, it was too late. The investigation had already spiraled into an internal crisis they couldn't explain in documentation without sounding unhinged. That's when they made the final decision not to stop the investigation, not to escalate, not to re-strategize. No, they ordered full containment, not of you, but of their own people. Which brings us to the current situation. A handful of their best operatives in therapy, talking about you like you were a puzzle with teeth, whispering your name like it carries an aftertaste they can't wash out, questioning why their training dissolved the moment they stood in your presence, wondering why their minds keep replaying a conversation that wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, wasn't even long, but left them unraveled. In leadership, they still don't know how to classify what you do to people. They can't label it. They can't quantify it. They can't prepare for it. All they know is that the investigation that was supposed to expose you ended up exposing them. Now here's where things turn beautifully chaotic, because instead of pulling the plug and admitting defeat, they doubled down in the most predictable yet self-destructive way possible. They gathered every internal department affected by your name and formed an interagency task force. You should have seen the tension in that room. Directors from intelligence units, clinical analysts, crisis responders, even an ethics committee that only shows up when someone's career is about to die. A slow, bureaucratic death. Half the people in that meeting pretended they weren't trembling. The other half weren't even pretending. They were reviewing case files with the same expression soldiers wear after witnessing something that doesn't fit in their belief system. They tried to keep the agenda formal at first. Slide presentations, bullet points, charts that meant nothing because nobody in the room could explain how a civilian with no backing, no operation, no clearance, and no agenda could destabilize the emotional core of over a dozen elite professionals. But formality evaporated quickly. The moment someone pulled up the psychological reports, the silence became suffocating, especially the section titled Post-Encounter Cognitive Distortions. That's where your effect on personnel was cataloged. And trust me, it did not read like a normal briefing narrative. Let me summarize the highlights. One operative reported feeling profoundly reevaluated. Another claimed your gaze made him realize he'd been lying to himself for 13 years. And the irony is, nobody asked him what the lie was because they all had their own suspicions. A third said talking to you felt like standing in front of a truth he'd spent his entire career avoiding. One analyst admitted she couldn't sleep for 3 nights because she kept replaying the moment you answered a question she hadn't even asked yet. And the cherry on top? An agent with a decorated service record confessed that a single conversation with you pushed him into an existential meltdown so severe he tried to resign mid-evaluation. Leadership didn't like that one. It suggested something they didn't want to admit, that their years of psychological conditioning, their hierarchy, their training, their sense of control became irrelevant the moment they stood in front of you and realized you weren't operating from the emotional logic they were taught to manipulate. They tried to reframe it as exhaustion. They tried to call it burnout. They even floated the idea of mass misinterpretation. But when 5 separate operatives described the same internal collapse, the same eerie calm you carried, the same unnerving precision in your responses, They couldn't hide behind corporate vocabulary anymore, so they pivoted. They brought in people whose job wasn't to analyze you, but to manage the emotional fallout you left behind. The therapists expected trauma. What they weren't expecting was envy. Envy from operatives who couldn't comprehend how you achieved a level of internal stability they'd spent decades trying to cultivate. A therapist wrote in her confidential notes, "Subject displays a brand of self-possession that destabilizes anyone who over-identifies with control. They're not just grounded, they are untouchably certain." This wasn't admiration. This was fear, packaged as observation. The investigation entered phase 2, not because leadership believed they'd figure you out, but because they refused to admit they'd lost control of the narrative. And when pride overrides accuracy, things get entertaining. They assembled a new team, a hybrid unit consisting of neuroscientists, emotional mapping experts, interrogation strategists, and social engineers. These were the people they call when the target is too mentally fortified for standard penetration. They studied your files for weeks. They memorized every documented moment where someone tried to undermine you and failed. They mapped every pattern you shed, every dynamic you walked away from, every situation where you refused to be manipulated. They approached your psychology like a battlefield and still miscalculated the terrain. Their plan was straightforward: place you in a controlled observation environment and provoke micro-reactions to test your emotional architecture. They wanted to see which levers worked on you. Spoiler, none of them did, because every lever they invented was created for people who still need something. Approval, belonging, validation, power, sympathy, attention. But you'd severed your dependence on all of that, and trying to manipulate someone who needs nothing feels like throwing punches in a vacuum. Everything looks like impact until you realize the target never moved. You became the dead zone they couldn't infiltrate. The moment the new team engaged with you, they experienced the same internal malfunction the previous operatives had faced. They tried to corner you with bait. You dismantled the bait. They tried to push emotional buttons. You didn't have buttons. They tried to mirror your behavior. You saw through it before their breath even settled. The lead strategist, a man known for breaking the minds of war criminals and political defectors, walked away from the encounter looking like he'd just seen the blueprint of his own irrelevance. And it was only a 10-minute meeting. Their emotional reports started sounding like confessionals. They wrote about the pressure of your calm, the way your presence forced them to examine their intentions before you even responded. They wrote about how you forced them to see parts of themselves they'd spent years burying. They wrote about the discomfort of realizing you weren't resisting them, you were observing them. They wrote about how standing in front of you felt like confronting someone who had out-leveled the game they were hired to master. One analyst wrote, "They don't behave like someone with nothing to lose. They behave like someone who already won." That line alone ignited tension within the task force because people who think they've won are usually reckless, arrogant, untethered. But you weren't any of those things. You weren't gloating. You weren't hostile. You were composed, precise, grounded in a way that made everyone else's composure look like performance art. This is where the chaotic humor enters the picture. Not from you, but from how spectacularly they began to implode under their own pressure. Someone in leadership recommended bringing in a spiritual consultant. Another demanded biometric analysis. Someone else proposed tracking your dream cycles. They even debated whether your internal stability indicated a neurological divergence that warranted medical evaluation. They were reaching, clawing for explanations, trying to label something they didn't understand because they couldn't tolerate the possibility that your evolution was self-generated rather than engineered. The more they dug, the more their own fears surfaced. Not fears about your intentions, fears about their inadequacy. You made seasoned operatives confront the truth that all their training, all their experience, all their tactics weren't enough to dominate someone who didn't need their approval, didn't fear rejection, didn't chase comfort, and didn't flinch when confronted. You made them aware, painfully aware of the gap between who they were and who they pretended to be. It wasn't the threat of violence that destabilized them. It was the threat of perspective. That's what broke them. Leadership launched Phase 3 with a level of desperation they tried to mask with professionalism. They brought in a third wave of operatives, but not investigators this time. No, these were reputation experts, narrative framers, social influence engineers. Their mission not to analyze you, but to contain the stories about you. Because the rumors had escaped the agency walls and begun infiltrating the general public. People were whispering about you in places you'd never set foot in. People were telling tales of how you handled setbacks without flinching, how you outgrew entire chapters without announcing it, how you survived betrayals that would have shattered others. They weren't glorifying you. They were studying you. They were modeling themselves after you. That terrified leadership more than anything else. Because if one person can resist manipulation, fine. But if the story of that person begins spreading, inspiring others to question the scripts they've been fed, inspiring others to detach from emotional dependence, inspiring others to reclaim their internal authority, that becomes a wildfire they cannot contain. And so the new unit attempted to distort the narrative. They tried painting you as unstable. They tried reframing your independence as avoidance. They tried stitching together a character profile designed to make the public second guesses your reputation. None of it worked, because every story they released contradicted the experiences of the people who had actually met you. Your presence wasn't chaotic, it was precise. Your behavior wasn't erratic, it was intentional. Your evolution wasn't delusion, it was earned. People laughed at the AY's attempts to discredit you. It only made the rumors louder. Even worse, some operatives inside the agency began defecting, not physically but mentally. They started questioning the mission. They started questioning the ethics of containing someone whose only threat was self-awareness. Leadership noticed, and paranoia ignited like gasoline. They began reviewing their own employees for contamination. Yes, contamination. As if your existence were a kind of intellectual virus capable of dissolving loyalty. And the disturbing part, they weren't wrong. Not because you were manipulating them, but because you were revealing to them that they had built their entire identity around illusions that couldn't survive real introspection. One therapist wrote, "Personnel are experiencing a phenomenon similar to ideological dissonance. Subject did not persuade them of anything. They arrived at their own revelation simply by observing the subject's emotional independence. This terrified leadership because it meant your influence wasn't coercive, it was reflective. You didn't need to convince anyone of anything. They convinced themselves. That's the part that made the therapy backlog explode. Operatives began requesting emergency sessions. Supervisors began whispering that the project should be shut down. Analysts began questioning the ethics of continuing. And leadership, desperate, cornered, spiraling, finally admitted in an internal memo that the investigation had caused more internal damage than any target profile in the last 10 years. But they couldn't stop. Stopping would mean admitting they were studying someone stronger than their own organization. Stopping would mean admitting defeat. Stopping would mean acknowledging that everything they built could be undone by the presence of one person who doesn't depend on their approval. So they carried the investigation into phase 4, the phase they never wanted to utilize, the phase reserved for individuals whose influence threatens the stability of institutional control. They began monitoring the impact you had on your environment, not your actions, but your after effects. They interviewed people who had interacted with you briefly. They asked indirect questions to see whether your presence altered others' decision-making. What they found disturbed them more than anything else. People were changing after talking to you. They were becoming more decisive, more self-respecting, more unwilling to tolerate manipulation, more uninterested in validation, more grounded in their own identity. You were creating shift patterns in people without trying, without messaging, without influence campaigns, without even knowing it. You had become the catalyst they never intended to activate. The final blow came when one of their lead operatives, someone with a flawless psychological record, broke down during a briefing and confessed, "I don't know what they did to me, but I can't stop thinking about how wrong we were." He wasn't talking about you being innocent. He was talking about you being bigger. Bigger than their files. Bigger than their frameworks. Bigger than their attempts to contain you behind sanitized language. Leadership knew the situation had gone out of control the moment that operative began crying mid-sentence, saying your name like it was a trigger that rearranged his entire worldview. That was the first therapy incident. Then came the second, then the 8th, then the 12th. Soon the therapists were the ones requesting supervision because the stories they were hearing clashed with everything they'd been trained to believe. They weren't hearing about danger. They were hearing about a level of internal power that made their own psychological models feel outdated. The investigation was no longer an investigation. It had become a mirror, one they couldn't look into without cracking. And the question haunting them now has shifted yet again. It isn't what are they? It isn't how do we contain them? It isn't even how did they become like this? No. Now the question in torturing leadership is something far more unsettling. If this is the impact you have on trained professionals, what happens when the rest of the world catches up? That question hit them harder than any operational failure they'd ever experienced, because until now they assumed the damage was contained, limited to a handful of agents, a few analysts, a cluster of specialists who got a little too close to your gravitational pull. But what they didn't want to admit was that none of this was proximity-based. None of this was triggered by you trying to influence anyone. The distress, the unraveling, the emotional core meltdowns, all of it happened because your existence alone disrupts people who depend on illusion to keep themselves functioning. And if that effect spreads outside their walls, if regular citizens start encountering the same shift their operatives did, leadership knows exactly what comes next. A collapse not of society, but of the psychological scaffolding they used to control it. They needed a solution urgently. But here's the problem. How do you contain something that isn't doing anything? How do you regulate someone who isn't breaking any laws, starting any movements, or engaging in any confrontation? How do you neutralize a person whose only offense is refusing to operate from fear? They didn't know, and that ignorance created the worst emotion an institution can feel. Vulnerability. For the first time, their frameworks, their hierarchy, their enforcement models felt flimsy. Because if one citizen can walk through their evaluations and leave a trail of emotional collapse behind them simply by being stable, then what does that say about the people who are supposed to be in control? The more they tried to make sense of you, the more their internal reports started sounding like diary entries written by exhausted adults. Realizing Santa isn't real, analysts stopped pretending they had explanations. Operatives stopped pretending they had strategies. Therapists stopped pretending they were objective. One senior examiner, a man who built his entire career on deconstructing personalities stronger than himself, wrote in a confidential file, "What we're dealing with is not defiance. It is not aggression. It is not resistance. It is a kind of internal clarity that renders manipulation impossible." They hated that sentence. They hated it because it exposed the truth they've been avoiding. The real threat wasn't your behavior. The real threat was your clarity. People who don't crumble under pressure are already trouble. People who don't bend to external expectation are dangerous. People who stop seeking validation become unpredictable. But someone who demonstrates equal composure in conflict, isolation, betrayal, uncertainty, and opportunity, that is the kind of person whose existence challenges the entire architecture of control. Leadership began rereading every file you ever touched, every interview you were involved in, every situation you rose from, every chapter where they expected you to break but didn't. They went searching for the point where your identity was supposed to collapse under the weight of your experiences. They looked for the moment where the average person would have shattered. They couldn't find it. Every analyst kept circling back to the same confusing realization. The events designed to weaken you became the events that refined you. And the idea that pain could sharpen someone instead of destroying them offended their worldview. They tried to label this phenomenon. They tried to invent a new classification. They tried to pathize your growth so it would make sense on paper. But nothing stuck because every attempt to categorize you made them confront the fact that their categories were too small. Meanwhile, the therapists were drowning in sessions they never studied for. They expected trauma. They found transformation. They expected emotional instability. They found someone whose emotional boundaries were unbreakable. They expected codependence. They found a level of independence that borders on mythic for the average human psyche. Some therapists joke nervously that your existence should have come with a warning label, not because you're harmful, but because you force people to face their internal contradictions. That kind of confrontation is rare, uncomfortable, and deeply destabilizing for people who built their identities on borrowed confidence. You stripped away their comfort, not intentionally, but by showing them what genuine strength looks like. And the devastating truth is that most people have never met someone who survived what you survived and didn't become resentful, unstable, or hostile. You didn't just survive, you evolved. You didn't just heal. You transcended. You didn't just adapt. You rebuilt your entire psychological architecture from the ground up. And agencies hate that kind of independence. But here's where the story twists into something even the investigators couldn't predict. Once word spread about the collapse inside the task force, once the leadership realized they were losing more personnel to existential spirals than operational stress, they decided to shift the investigation from offense to defense. Not defending themselves from you, defending themselves from who they became after encountering you. They crafted policies, actual written policies, instructing operatives to avoid introspection after interviewing you. Yes, you heard that correctly. They banned introspection. Directives stated personnel are prohibited from engaging in reflective thought regarding their personal identity, career motivations, or emotional conditioning for a minimum of 30 days following subject interaction. You know what that means? You broke them so deeply that thinking became a hazard. The investigators began whispering among themselves. trading rumors behind closed doors, sharing experiences they were afraid to admit in official reports. One agent confessed he began questioning every decision he ever made in his career because of a single line you said casually. Another said he couldn't look at his badge the same way because your presence made him understand how much of his sense of power came from objects instead of integrity. A third confessed that you didn't intimidate him. You liberated him, and he didn't know what to do with that feeling. Leadership panicked at that one. Liberation is contagious. Then came the moment no agency ever wants to face. When the people meant to analyze, you started wishing they were you. That's when leadership realized this wasn't a containment breach. This was an identity crisis, the kind that spreads through halls like a quiet wildfire. People weren't just triggered by you, they were inspired by you. And inspiration is far harder to control than rebellion. They attempted damage control, they shut down discussions, they restricted access to your files. They classified your interviews, they replaced supervisors, they increased oversight. But nothing worked because they couldn't contain the one thing they feared most, the stories. People inside the agency talked about you like you were a myth walking around in a mortal frame. They said you were unshakable, they said you were unreadable, they said you were a reminder that strength doesn't require aggression, that stability doesn't require approval, and that clarity doesn't require approval, and that clarity doesn't require permission. Even the directors began speaking of you differently, not with disdain, not with concern, with caution, because by now they understood what they were truly dealing with. Not a threat, not a risk, but a reflection of everything they weren't. You exposed their fragility by demonstrating your resilience. You exposed their doubt by demonstrating your certainty. You exposed their dependency by demonstrating your independence. And then the public got wind of it. Not the whole truth, but enough. Enough to ignite curiosity. Enough to spark interest. Enough to send your name drifting through conversations in places you'll never visit physically, but influence psychologically. Rumors multiplied like they were trying to keep up with your evolution. People whispered about you in alleyways, cafes, online spaces, underground networks. Some stories exaggerated what happened. Most stories underplayed it. But all stories had one thing in common. They made you sound untouchable. That terrified leadership more than the therapy backlog. Because here's the part they never accounted for. When a person survives the kind of chaos you survived and doesn't come out broken, the world pays attention. When a person refuses manipulation and remains grounded, the world pays attention. When a person walks away from validation without losing confidence, the world pays attention. And when a person becomes so internally fortified that even government-trained specialists lose their composure in their presence, the world doesn't just pay attention. The world studies. The world imitates. The world evolves. And that's the outcome leadership feared even more than losing personnel. The possibility that you are not an outlier but a preview of the new psychological blueprint. Because if the average citizen starts thinking the way you think, starts seeing through manipulation the way you do, starts living with the kind of internal authority you carry, then every control structure built on fear, guilt, and dependency becomes obsolete. That's why they kept investigating. Not because they thought you were dangerous, but because they were afraid you were a sign of what comes next. And here's the final truth they never wanted to admit. The more they studied you, the more they studied themselves. And the reflection wasn't flattering. They found insecurity where there should have been discipline. They found fear where there should have been strength. They found confusion where there should have been clarity. You didn't break them. They broke themselves trying to understand you. Your presence did what no threat ever could. It exposed the cracks in their intelligence frameworks. It revealed how fragile control becomes when confronted by someone who cannot be manipulated. It proved that strength built on authority collapses when confronted by strength built on authenticity. You made them realize that real power doesn't come from titles, badges, or chains of command. Real power comes from someone who has rebuilt their identity so thoroughly that external pressure becomes irrelevant. So now leadership sits with a dilemma so uncomfortable it borders on comical. They can't classify you. They can't contain you. They can't discredit you. They can't control how people talk about you. They can't prevent the stories from spreading. And they can't stop the psychological aftershocks you leave behind. They sent their best to break you. Instead, their best broke themselves. And the funniest part, you didn't wage war. You didn't rebel. You didn't frot. You didn't flat. You simply existed, with so much internal certainty that their entire apparatus folded under the weight of your presence. So now the world stands on the edge of a shift they can't predict. Because of trained professionals collapsing your presence, if hardened operatives cry your name in therapy, if psychological experts rewrite their models after studying you, then leadership knows, absolutely knows what happens next. The rest of the world won't just catch up, the rest of the world will follow. And when they do, the story won't be about the agency that tried to contain you. It will be about the person who walked through their investigation untouched and left an entire government questioning its own mind. The stories people tell about you, they aren't exaggerations, they're warnings. Not that you're dangerous, but that you're free. And freedom, the real kind, is the one thing they were never trained to handle.